Welcome to another episode of the Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Today, another segment of Making Sense with Gabriel. Stick around and Gabriel Gaarden will join us again. Welcome back, Gabriel, to Making Sense with Gabriel.
Awesome. Great to be back. Thanks, Nancy.
My question for you this week from one of our viewers is, what's wrong with dairy and eggs?
Another great question. So there's a lot wrong with dairy and eggs. Number one, let's speak to the health perspective first, but then I'd also like to include, of course, the environmental and the ethical perspective, because those are important pieces as well. But I approach this as a health professional, as a registered dietitian, and health was the biggest and the first driver that encouraged me to want to make the transition to a plant-based, whole food plant-based vegan diet. But of course, I'm equally as passionate about the environment and about the ethical perspective as well. So starting with the health perspective, dairy is one of the richest sources of saturated fat that exists within our diet, right? If you look at all the foods that we eat. And of course, something that the dairy industry did to combat that problem, because we have so much science to demonstrate that consuming a diet rich in saturated fat is going to drive up our cholesterol levels, specifically our bad cholesterol levels. That's the LDL cholesterol. When you get a cholesterol reading or blood test, you'll get your overall cholesterol, and then you'll get two other numbers. They break that overall number into two others, the LDL and the HDL cholesterol. So the LDL is the bad, the HDL is known as good cholesterol. And so the higher the LDL, the worse for our overall health and for our risk for cardiovascular disease, right? Like heart attack and stroke, things like that. And so we want to bring LDL down. A good way to remember that for people who don't already know how to differentiate LDL from HDL is think about the L in LDL, the first L, as lethal, right? So this stuff can kill you. LDL cholesterol will kill. And there's really no doubt about that. There's a few pseudoscientists out there, a few doctors and other researchers who've either been paid off by the industry, like the dairy industry or the meat industry or the egg industry, or they just don't know what they're talking about. You know, they're not great researchers, or they have some other kind of ethical, bad stuff going on that have tried to purport that saturated fat is back, right? We all saw the Time article with the little curl of butter, and it said saturated fat was back. That was based on two meta-analyses, which are certain types of scientific studies that were encouraged afterwards to be retracted because the statistical analysis that was done in those meta-analyses was so poor, lacked such scientific rigor that they should never have been published. Full stop, right? So I want to make that clear to everyone. Saturated fat was never back, and it's not good for you. And it raises the LDL cholesterol, which has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to raise our risk for cardiovascular disease. And cardiovascular disease, ladies and gentlemen, is the #1 killer of Americans as well as many other people around the world. And so we got to bring our LDL cholesterol down. And how do we do that? We got to bring our saturated fat consumption down. And I talked earlier about what the dairy industry did and others. Well, what did they do? Well, they started removing the fat from milk, right? So then we got things like, instead of whole milk, we have the 2%, we have the 1%, we have the skim milk, right? And that certainly helps. When it just looking at the overall health perspective, those lower fat milks are lower in saturated fat, they're lower in cholesterol. And so that's going to help bring down our LDL cholesterol levels. But the other issue there is just removing the fat didn't solve all the problems, because you've still got the dairy protein, you still got the dairy sugar, something known as lactose, something that most all of us have heard about, because lactose intolerance is a very prominent condition, incredibly common. And it's a very important racial and social justice issue, because our Native American brothers and sisters, our Asian community, our people of Afro-American or, Black, the people within the Black community, as well as Hispanics or the people from the Latino or Latinx communities, have much higher rates of lactose intolerance. And we have the dairy industry trying to shove more dairy down these people's gullets, right? Of course, they want everybody to drink more dairy because it's not about providing nutrition to the public, about providing calcium and about providing all this wonderful nutrition that dairy provides. It's mostly about making money, right? It's an industry, and industries are built on making money, right? And pleasing their shareholders and growing their profits, full stop. So that being known, lactose intolerance is an incredibly important issue. Now, of course, we have things like lactate. I know people could counter. Lactate is a lactose-free milk. I don't know what it would taste like because lactose is an important flavor that makes milk what milk is, right? So if you remove all the sugar from milk, I can't imagine it tasting very good, but that's besides the point because nobody should be drinking cow's milk, right? Because cow's milk was milk for cows' babies, for baby calves. It was never meant for human consumption, right? And so once we leave our mother's breast as babies, as humans, just like every other species on Earth, we shouldn't be consuming milk anymore, especially the milk from a 1,000-pound bovine, mammal, like a cow, right? Or even more. Many cows are even bigger than that, right? But generally speaking, we shouldn't be consuming the lactation secretions of a 1,000-pound bovine mammal. It's so different from a human being. Their milk, of course, is very different from human milk. If you look at the overall fat content, protein content, carbohydrate content, right, the macronutrients in cow's milk are incredibly different from the macronutrient profile or ratios in human breast milk. And of course, it's full of all the other things, right? The natural cow hormones, right? Like estradiol, which is estrogen. These things are very bad for our health. And so we got to get that out whenever possible. And of course, the dairy proteins are also an issue, right? And those proteins are going to be the whey proteins and the casein proteins. And there's a ton of implications with having, rich amounts of those in our diet. We got to lower the animal protein. And I could go into that, but that's a separate podcast. You've already heard enough about saturated fat, cholesterol. We know that's an issue. We know we got to bring that down. And it's a similar issue in eggs, right? Eggs are very low in calories overall. So if you look at the overall amount of saturated fat in one egg, it's not a lot because eggs have so few calories. But if you look at the overall composition of the nutrients, like I talked about with dairy and cow's milk compared to breast milk, the overall percentage of calories, it's a rich source of saturated fat. Even though you're not getting a ton of saturated fat in eggs because they're so low in calories, still the overall composition, the egg yolk is very rich in saturated fat because that egg yolk was meant to be a rich source of nutrients for a baby chick, right? Again, just like cow's milk was meant for baby cows, the nutrition within an egg and an egg yolk was meant to grow a baby chick because that gives the baby chick everything it needs to become a little bird before it hatches from its shell, right? So it's a very dense source of nutrients, very different from the nutrient composition that we find within plant-based foods. And we know that the more of these whole plant-based foods that we eat, the better our health becomes and the lower our risk for our leading killers, like cardiovascular disease, like diabetes, right? Like numerous forms of cancer. And then eggs are also very rich in a substance called choline. There's a number of issues with eating too much choline that relates to the animal protein. Animal protein and choline can both be broken down. We get them in our mouth, they go down to our stomach, they get into our small intestine, and then they end up at the very bottom of all that whole system in the large intestine where our gut bugs live, right? Our gut bacteria, which is called our microbiome. And when those gut bugs get a hold of this animal protein and this choline, specifically carnitine, which is an amino acid that's rich in animal-based proteins, right? Animal-based foods, and choline, when our gut bugs get a handle of that and they start munching on that, they produce these byproducts after they digest it. And one of those byproducts is called TMA, which is called trimethylamine. We absorb that into our blood system, it gets to our liver, and then our liver oxidizes it, and it becomes TMAO, trimethylamine oxide. And TMAO is a nasty little chemical because when it starts flowing around all of our blood vessels in our cardiovascular system, right? Could be our heart, could be our other organs. or could be all of our muscles where we've got all this blood flowing. TMAO starts to damage our blood vessels, right? It's like this little hammer or this little chisel or this little pick, and it goes around and it starts injuring our blood vessels. And the injuries are really small because it's a small little molecule that's running around our blood vessels. But the whole issue is when we're eating dairy and eggs and meat on a daily basis, right? 3 squares a day, over 20, 30, 50, 70 years, those little tiny injuries that happen from TMAO start to add up to bigger injuries. And so TMAO is kind of the first part of the cascade that creates the plaques, which lead to things that those plaques then break off and they create those blood clots that then hit our heart or they hit our brain. And that's what causes strokes and heart attacks. And so TMAO is incredibly important in that whole cascade. We want to avoid TMAO. And the best way to do that is to get those animal products out of your diet. And that includes dairy and that includes eggs. So you get those out of your diet, you get TMAO down, and you stop injuring your blood vessels, something that's really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you for that information. Wow. That's basically, we should not consume anything that comes from another animal because we're animals and, so we shouldn't really, whether it's goat, cow, pig, chicken, we should leave them off if we want to have a healthy physical condition.
Certainly. There's no reason to be consuming animals or their byproducts. Nutrients come most safely and most nutritiously packaged in the form of whole plant foods when it comes to human nutrition, right? Certainly. It's the best thing we can do for our health.
Thank you, Gabriel. Plant power, baby.
Rock on, Nancy. Boom, boom.
Until next time.
Sounds great. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and remember, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Live vegan.